I was just going to ask you, Ryan, how he kind of found Integral, got into Integral, and then you want to roll after that.
Sure. Yeah, I wanted to hear about Robb's, journey, political journey with that too.
Okay.
A man with no land.
Great. Okay, so we're good to go, guys. Matt, you want to do the intro? I think we are live.
Yeah, awesome. Welcome to a new episode of Growing Down. Today's guest is Robb Smith. He is the author of The Great Release and co-founder of Integral Life. Robb, welcome to Growing Down.
Thank you. Very nice to be here. Nice to see you guys.
Awesome. Well, I was wondering, Robb, if you could tell us a little bit about how you found Integral and why it interests you.
Yeah. Well, the short version of this story, and of course we all have versions of these kinds of things and they can go for a long time, but I'll try to do it very quickly, which is that I increasingly, I believe there is elements to this in most of the Integral stories that I've heard, which is that Integral people tend to have some integrative instincts from a very young age. They tend to have a mind which seeks patterns that connect. I tend to think that they're going to, I've said this before publicly, and I can't wait till there's research on it, but I tend to think they're going to find this correlates with openness to experience as a trait structure. And I think they're going to find a sort of a neurobiological correlation with that in the final analysis in the brain structure. But in any case, always thought about patterns that connect from an early age. Also had a pretty deep spiritual journey, young, both in the Christian tradition and then in the Eastern tradition. Even in early adolescence, I was reading the Eastern wisdom traditions. And then I had a very secular aim to work in finance, to work in innovation through college and what have you. And so these things were kind of always blending and brewing in the background. And I was involved in the venture capital business. I was involved in entrepreneurship in the state of Nevada. I was doing things that at this point I would look back and characterize more as social entrepreneurship. The idea of, even back then, it was a very integrative idea that I had when I was in my early 20s. How do you create an innovation? How do you turn a whole state into an innovation economy that's ready for the 21st century? That was the business plan I wrote for the state of Nevada. They didn't ask me to, I just did it. And so I was already thinking about this from a kind of a social entrepreneurial point of view. And then how do I go and create the political, business, academic interconnections that need to do that? Well, I went through that, did that for, almost a decade. And at the same time, I'm also growing and evolving spiritually and in other ways, philosophically. I've always had a deep interest in philosophy. So at one point I decided, what really happened is I was a CEO of a company that was going through a turnaround, and it was just a brutal experience, just brutal. Like we should have shut the company down. It was a totally lost cause, but I was just so stubborn and so committed, and I was all in and working, 100-hour weeks. And classic Satori experience, my ego broke. Like I just broke. I was under so much suffering and just broke and just laid me wide open. And something I read had a simple koan, like, what am I resisting right now? And that one question brought me into the present. And I spent 3 days basically in a version of kind of a Satori-like trance fundamentally. I mean, I was functional, but I was seeing reality in a very different way. So I was enmeshed in this deeply transcendent state experience. And I was forever transformed by that, because at that point, my ego never came back online the same way it had prior. And it was at the same time that I was also reading a lot from various philosophical traditions. And I happened to I was on a trip to, I think it was to Seattle, and I happened to see Ken Wilber's face shining back at me in the bookstore. And I had recognized this book and his face from other times. I always thought it was weird. I always actually just thought it was a weird cover. I think it was Brief History of Everything. And I can recall the feeling of going, yeah, I've seen his book before. And it's just kind of weird. That day, though, I decided, all right, I'm going to pick it up. I'll buy it. And I found it very, very enlightening. I found it very useful as a map to start to bring together a whole series of threads that I can now put, and you guys understand the language of, okay, when you're going through green structure of development cognitively, and you have kind of broken the world apart into and see its systems. You see its ideologies. You see these various pieces. You're probably not an expert in any of them yet, but you can at least see them and grok that the world of orange, this univocal, uniperspectival, monolinear system of a pre-given set of realities isn't actually real. It's real for that epistemological frame, but at some point you grow beyond that and you're in green. The problem is you have all these things all over and it's a total mess and you're confused. It's enchanting, but it's also confusing. And so what happens is when someone gives you a little bit of the cereal box decoder ring that says, here, if you just look at it like this and things start to fall in place, well, then your integrative mind starts to get deeply satisfied. And that's what happened for me pretty quickly, common experience for many of us. And the journey of having a label for what was next came online. Oh, it feels like it's integrative, it's integral. And so it was a few years after that, maybe 3-4 years after that, that I first then approached the Integral Institute and started chatting with them about some things. And it was very quickly thereafter, Ken said, hey, why don't you come run the show? And I was ready to move out of what I was doing. And so I chose to do that.
Very cool, Rob. Very cool. Yeah, just to build on that, your story, I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about, I guess this is kind of a two-part question, your own political evolution, how your perspective on politics has changed over your life. And, I understand you started out as a conservative or more conservatively minded, and I'm curious how you politically identify these days, with integral and stuff. And also, just to add to that, on this show, we try to explicitly say that we are an integral left, or offering an integral left, or a progressively integral perspective. At least that's our framework, and that's also our bias, right? That we're trying to be honest about. And some people have not reacted well to the term and are like, integral left that's not really integral. And other people are very happy that they found something that more accurately describes their philosophical and political orientation. So just offering that up, what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. Well, let's start at the back, let's start where you ended and then go backwards,
Sure.
Which is, I don't think anybody, I think that's actually a misunderstanding of what integral political activism is. I think that in my experience and my understanding of what I know about integral political philosophy today is every one of us is going to have a cosmic address and a typological set of biases that come from our life experiences, that come from our karma, that come from our core fears and core drives, and those are different. Now they may cluster into various groupings. We could look at Enneagrams, for example. You're going to see obviously 9 clusters, and you're going to see some core drives and core fears that might look similar. But the point is that you're going to be able to find some correlation between that and the way somebody has a bias towards this ever-present polarity between conservation and progression. And so a more sophisticated way, I think, to consider it is, where does somebody fall on that, maybe as a tendency? Because any of us might be in the moment conservative about a given instance. There's something in the past that we want to bring forward and preserve and not negate. That's a conservative move. And there's something that in another instance, in another context, we want to progress. We are ready to transcend what's available today. We want to push the boundary of what is available today in the present. And so that is a fundamentally progressive move. Labeling those two things left and right is a fine, but for more sophisticated integral political conversants, it's going to be a little bit of a crude way to think about it, and it's going to be a little bit confusing to a lot of people who are using a conventional mind to consider the left and the right. So one of the things I try to do is help people understand that those labels act as heavy lifting words for something that's going on more deeply underneath at the deeper level of reality of our philosophical political commitments, which is our relationship to conservation versus progression. And those are very, very, very contextual questions. Even though admittedly we will have biases. We will have biases towards conservation, maybe in hierarchy and these other things. We may have other people might have biases towards progression, anti-hierarchicalism, and that kind of thing. So I suppose I didn't answer your question about my own journey. That's a pretty good frame for my own journey, where I started in, growing up in the 80s, growing up in kind of white middle-class suburban America. I came into the world with the kind of Republican inheritance. I mean, actually, my dad ran Reagan's campaign in Florida. So I came into this with a neoliberal Republican inheritance. And I was a believer in the American mythos, geopolitically, that we were a force for good in the world, in the heart of modernism and in the heart of a Cold War era. There are partial truths about everything about that, but it is also deeply partial, right? And in all the ways that I've talked about elsewhere, and the Great Release and what's actually happening as we broke down and have failed our moral standing in the world. America has. And then, of course, as I became a more and more integral thinker and appreciated more and more of the polarities that I was navigating, or the dialectics or contradictions I'd run up against, of course, I was integrating those. And so now I would say, I am probably, I don't really consider myself either conservative or progressive. Actually, I consider myself a sophisticated integral political person, but not particularly conservative or progressive. If you see me taking on and claiming conservative, for example on Twitter, I'm doing it for a particular reason. I'm doing it to claim tribal credibility in order to then invite a new form of transformational thinking on behalf of other conservatives who are ready to maybe come into contact with the contradictions of their points of view.
Would you say there's a kind of political jujitsu move that's going on there? Like being able to kind of take that position in a genuine way, in a good faith kind of way, and then also kind of reveal that contradiction at the same time. Like you're kind of taking their position, but you're also sort of offering something else in the hopes that it is genuinely transformative, right? So
Yeah.
kind of wondering how you see that strategy as a move.
And that is the difficult part about where we are today. And I in my keynote speech, it's never been better, never felt worse. In one part of that speech, I talk about how a lot of what passes as the conservative movement today, Trump Nation, is a non-Newtonian substance. It is in a collective state of a siege mentality. It feels itself to be a persecuted minority. It transacts in symbols of persecution. And the more it gets attacked by conventional moral logic from orange and green, which is, let's say, 60% of the country, the more it feels animated in the emotional currency that it transacts inside the social holon that is Trump Nation. That means that the epistemic closure is almost impossible to overcome. So you, even when you make the move to try to rationally sympathize with the partial truths and partial virtues of, let's say, what Trump has done for them, it still has to you're still relying on some rationality kicking in. And the reality is this is not fundamentally a rational process that's going on. These, as I said then, it's not emotional truths people are transacting in, it is emotional ones. Populism lives and breathes and survives on emotional truths. So, and it is like any, it is like any cult or any deeply emotional tribe in that respect. So it is actually quite difficult to be persuasive in today's day and age, actually. And you can make all the judo moves you want. It's a good way to put it. It is not clear. Think about how many people are trying. Millions and millions of people, from pundits to documentaries to family members all over. And is it having any effect? Maybe over the 4 years, maybe a little bit at the margin, but no, what we've seen is the degree to which in a green techno-economic socioculture, which we are involved in right now, where there's massive autonomy, there is massive alienation of meaning, and where, frankly, there is no hierarchical moral guideposts anymore, how impossible it is to create a moral community of sanction. People just don't give a shit anymore. There's no moral community that can sanction another community anymore, and that is a deeply problematic life condition of green. And I think the transformation age will solve this, and I think it'll solve it for a simple reason: it has to. I don't think a society can sustain itself this way.
That's a good segue into the transformation age, Rob. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit. I know it's hard to maybe summarize sort of the Great Release and stuff, but kind of where we're at maybe with the neoliberalism, financialization happening in the 70s to kind of where you see we are today, sort of a transition from the information age to the transformation age.
Yeah, and I know you guys have seen some of the other podcasts, so I don't know how much you want me to repeat myself. Maybe you could give me some guidance on that, because obviously, I think my last podcast we did an hour and a half on just that question. So,
yeah, well, I think we're in agreement that maybe capitalism run amok is not the best idea, and obviously, I kind of see you as the wizard of lower right, and so I was kind of hoping to see. You're obviously an advocate, I think, for capitalism in some regard, and just sort of where you see how does this transition happen? And you can get into specific policies maybe that you think can maybe help move us into this, because when we say transformation age, I'm always left with, well, what are we going to transform into? There's always the possibility where it splits, where we could become more fascist compared to more democratic or liberal or whatever. So I was wondering if you see some key sort of pivot points or things that you're advocating for to make sure that we're moving in a direction that is fair and it's sort of the best move in your opinion.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, gosh, there's so many ways we could approach that. But if we look at, going back to your original question, then if we look at some of the things we got wrong, like we actually have this beautiful gift of the U.S. circa 1950, 1955, 1960, where we have a ton of power, and we have both the moral stature, the economic stature, and really kind of the moral inheritance of the Constitution, with these beautiful ideals. Even though we all recognize we as humans fail those ideals regularly, still it is this gorgeous articulation of this aspirational thing. And here it is. This system is now the world power. That's extraordinary gift on a lot of levels, right? And as I've talked about in the Great Release, this system continues to win and win and win. One that wins World War II, it's economically dominant. And as we see from all complex systems, the apex predator in a system usually, if not always, ends up in a situation where it then starts to make decisions that are not holistic, right? They're not holistic enough. So it then begins to extract from its surrounding ecosystem, and then to the victor go the spoils, and that becomes an increasing source of system lock-in for power. And so what happens then is the whole system becomes increasingly irresilient, meaning increasingly unable to adapt to changing life conditions. power becomes more and more entrenched. It becomes more extractive. And then, so this brings us up to the story of, let's say, where this is beginning to happen as we start to shift through the 1970s. I've talked before about how we go off the gold standard in 71, which liberates the U.S. dollar to be printed at full scale in any way that's needed. We can continue to run trade and capital deficits. Trade and budget deficits that continue to flood the world with dollars. Why do we do this? We do this. An ungenerous reading would say we do it to maintain power. We do it because we want to finance a military. We want to continue to have Germany and Japan, and to some degree China and the southeastern countries. We want them on the dollar system. We want them on the dollar system because the more that the dollar system is in place, the more we have economic hegemony, and the more we can finance our own internal lifestyle. So this is a set of policy decisions that are both kind of consciously, intentionally made by the foreign policy community in the U.S. and by the power holders in the U.S. But there's also a concomitant, co-arising philosophical and policy set of changes are going on inside the U.S. domestically. We have a deregulation movement starting with Reagan in 1980. Similar one with Thatcher in England, right? As a blowback to kind of the progressive era since FDR, right? The 30-year prior progressive era since FDR. We have the liberation of retirement accounts with both the ERISA reform of 1978, 79, 401k policy change in the early 80s. Then you have the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine in media in, what is that, 86? You then have the Greenspan put, where basically the financial markets get the idea after the 87 stock market crash that the chairman of the Federal Reserve has kind of tacitly told them that he's on their side in terms of the value of financial assets. By then, okay, so you can begin to see how these systemic policy shifts are happening, right? And these are all sowing the seeds for the massive systemic, true kind of like critical power lock-in and dysfunction that we find ourselves in 2020. All of this stuff, each one is changing the rules of the game just in such a way that we see Fox News arise and we see cable news arise and we see political ideology as entertainment, right? That happens with, 86. It happens with in the financialization, neoliberalization happens with the flood of capital coming in from around the world through the 70s. But then, your boomers are, as I've said before, your boomers are forming families. They're in the early parts of their life, all through the 70s. They're buying a ton of stuff. Now they're starting to put all their money into the retirement accounts, right? So the capital market's exploding. Wall Street's exploding, right? Greenspan's helping. You see the Soviet Union fall in 1990. So a lot of the geopolitical accommodations that may have acted like an ecosystemic constraint a little bit in the global system goes away after 1990, right? So, and this is probably too long to get into here, but you might say, okay, well, what did that do? It did a lot of things geopolitically and militarily and what have you. But I tend to also think it probably, to some degree, led to Clinton and some of the policies he put in place, like 1999 repealing Glass-Steagall, which eliminated the boundary between commercial and investment banking. And so there was one more, and by the way, it was put in place in 1933 because they had learned the lesson of the Depression, which is you actually need a healthy Main Street banking sector. Your Main Street banking, which is your everyday economy for everyday people, and their everyday lending and borrowing activities for actually employing people and doing real economic stuff. You do not want Wall Street being the sole source of that, and it becoming securitized. And we didn't learn that lesson. Well, we had forgotten the lesson, right? Because we had all the power on the global stage by the mid 90s. We thought, I mean, Fukuyama's end of history, right? We thought that the United States had won history. We thought that's it. We're done. The US is totally hegemonic. We can't go wrong. Stock market's booming, all this stuff, right? So, and that's why I kind of put the Soviet Union fall in there, because I tie it a little bit to the underlying backdrop of the kinds of then decisions and changes that were made even 9 years later. As we said, we're going to forget some of the lessons of the Depression, repeal Glass-Steagall, right? Well, we learned our lesson 9 years later after that in 2008, why you shouldn't do that, right? Why, and by the way, they never put it back in place. So we're still living with that problem. So we're now in 99, get to 2001, and we give China WTO access, right? Why do we give World Trade Organization access to China? Because two reasons. One is sort of like, one's a reasonable explanation. The other one may be the more cynical and realer explanation. The more cynical one is, well, because China is the biggest market in the world, theoretically, we want their cheap labor. We're already using their cheap labor, but we really want access to their markets, and we need to continue growing. And so the assumption is that it's going to be a field day if we can get access to China, and so grant them access to WTO. What actually happened was the reverse. China ended up keeping their markets closed, taking a lot of the intellectual property, and ended up using the dollar hegemony we had established to actually start building out Chinese projects around the world in order to finance, recycle their own surpluses to some degree, through building what is fundamentally a Chinese hegemon. And we had power structures in the place of Wall Street and others who convinced Washington that that was a great idea, with not a single consideration for the working or middle class of the United States. No accommodation for them whatsoever. And yet it's obvious that they were going to get absolutely obliterated. And they already were, right? I mean, capital-labor relationship shifted in 1980, and they were already getting obliterated. They're getting obliterated by inflation, getting obliterated by asset appreciation for all these reasons we've talked about. China is just the icing on the cake. So when Trump arises in 2016, in one sense, it shouldn't be a surprise. Like, we have a very, very pissed off, aggrieved class of folks in this country who have been taken to the cleaners by financial and political elites for 40 years under a set of ideologies that have been just badly misconstrued and misapplied with all of these systemic changes. So now, both in terms of the media ecosystem we have to educate people, it's totally screwed up. The financing side, totally screwed up, right? Because none of the money is going to Main Street anymore. It's all going to financial assets. So after 2008, when the whole house of cards collapses and they reflate the entire thing with printing of the money, most of that goes to financial asset increases. It does not go to real productive economic creation. So we've zombified the economy in the process. So we've zombified our economy. We've completely alienated our people. We've polarized our political process. Again, all of these things are building massive structural irresilience. And there's a lot of pieces to it, but you can see, if you just looked at specific moments in time, like, oh, well, there's a piece of the system that just went totally shit the bed. And then here's another one that did it. Here's another one that did it. And then just add a few decades, and those things add up, and they add up, and they add up. And it's increasingly grinding all the gears together of this well-functioning system. And now it's totally locked, and now it's in real trouble. So that's just a way of looking backwards. So now when we look for the next 10 or 15 years forwards, we can say, well, boy, how do we get out of this mess? And the answer is, we need some suffering. We need some serious, serious suffering, because people don't wisen up without it, and they're not available to progressive remedies. And this is a moment where you do need progressive remedies. You do need to really go back and amend some of the damage that's been done. And are they progressive? Well, they're progressive in the sense that they're conservative. Like, you actually need to go back and learn the lesson of the Depression and probably rethink about what you're doing in your social contract with your financial class, meaning Wall Street, so that it can't run the show. It can't run the table, because it will continue to if you don't put in place the proper, regulations that do that. And so, I mean, I guess I'll stop there, but, and I should probably mention one more thing, which is campaign finance reform. Like, none of this happens if you don't figure out how to get the money out of the politics in two ways. One is the financing of elections, and two is the gerrymandering. Like, if we don't attack those things, we probably don't change the horrible set of incentives and disincentives that occur for our political class to actually be representative, because they are not representative. They actually know it. And so they're just waiting for the American people to get pissed off enough to force the change upon them.
Yeah, very, very clear analysis. I wanted to actually pivot a little bit to some commentary. I don't know if you follow Yanis Varoufakis and some of his analysis of some recent events, but he had a very interesting tweet, an analysis on his website talking about how in August, he says, financial capitalism has decoupled from the capitalist economy, skyrocketing out of Earth's orbit, leaving behind its broken lives and dreams. As the UK sinks into the worst recession ever, and the US edges towards failed state status, the FTSE 100 goes up 2%, and S&P 500 breaks an all-time record. And he's talking about, like, part of this, that the kind of negative vision of this great transformation is something that is post-capitalist, but even more intensified, even more abstracted and decoupled from actual everyday workers, et cetera, that kind of decoupling process you've been describing, and it ramps that up to a whole other level. So I was wondering if you could comment on this kind of analysis. How do you see things going? How do you sort of interpret recent events in the economy?
Yeah, it's great. Really, really great question. He's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. And he makes a really, really set of fantastic arguments in the Global Minotaur about, how what he experienced as they, came out of the 08, 09 Reformation and with a Great Recession. And we ran the same, as I've said before recently, we're running the same playbook today that we ran back then, which is, if you print enough dollars, you can reflate the entire global economic system. Now, taken as a single statement, there's truth in that, of course. The problem is, if all the money ends up stuck in financial assets, meaning the value of bonds, the value of stocks, the value of the FTSE or whatever we're looking at, right? If that's what happens, and none of it truly gets into the real economy, if it doesn't get into, you already have over-indebted real consumers whose real wage has been stagnant for years and years under the yoke of a false inflation metric, right? So the Fed is reporting one inflation, totally fake reporting. They exclude food, they exclude, I think they exclude healthcare, and they adjust housing for hedonic life improvements. So it's total BS. And if you want to, I had a tweet thread on why you should think about your life priced in gold, and it'll show that. Gold is always kind of the truth teller. That's one of the reasons I like gold, is it's like you can't trick it. You can't trick gold. And you can't trick gold because for thousands of years, humans have used gold when they feel real inflation in their lives. And so if you want to watch what happens with inflation on a real basis, watch gold prices. And what gold prices will tell you is that there's been massive real inflation over the course of the last 40 years and 30 years and 20 years. While the Fed will say, inflation's not meeting our target. BS. Populism rises on the back of inflation. Okay, so why are we seeing that? We're seeing it because ultimately, as I've said before, the political class has made a decision that they're going to reflate the boomers. They have to. It's a political contract they made with them. These are the people that have the power of the money and the vote, and they vote. And they're going to have to keep their pensions solvent. They're going to have to keep their financial assets solvent. They're going to have to keep their 5,000-foot suburban properties whole at $400 a foot, even though nobody can afford that, which is why interest rates they're dropping interest rates down, because that entire generation of boomers has to have a way to liquidate those those houses to the next generation. Next generation doesn't have the equity to buy those houses. So I think we're going to see a massive collapse in housing prices, at least in certain markets and in certain kinds of certain value levels or certain price levels. But what you're seeing is a political and financial accommodation of the baby boom, fundamentally. So we're still living in a literally a world that's defined by the 10 years after World War II today, because the political class doesn't have a good answer to that. So what Giannis is pointing to is the fact that the Federal Reserve of the U.S. has doubled its balance sheet in the last several months to $8 trillion or $7.5 trillion or whatever it is. I mean, a massive amount of money, because they're trying to reflate the value of financial assets. It is anathema to them, the idea that a free market would actually exist in the value of financial assets, because if that happened, they would have to face what is fundamentally a deflationary wall that is hitting as we speak and will continue to hit over the next 8 years. What do I mean by deflationary wall? I mean that we don't have particularly robust productivity gains. So we're not getting good economic growth from a productivity point of view. And we have a retiring baby boom labor force that is literally at the peak of their retirement and will be over the next 5 years. So the labor participation rate is going to go down and your entire economy is going to contract. What that does is it deflates prices because it brings down overall demand. You just have less people working, and therefore, and they're doing more saving because they're moving into retirement and they can't afford as much, right? All of that means that demand comes down. And what happens when demand comes down? Aggregate demand comes down when you've washed the world in debt. You default. You have massive defaults. So what we have is a humongous, gargantuan solvency problem on the back of this sort of generational shift of facts. You cannot, you can bullshit a lot of things in this world. What you can't bullshit is age. And we have a lot of people who are in their early to mid 60s who do not want to work to 80 years old. And that's just you can't give birth. You're 50 years late if you want to give birth to more people to fix this problem. Like, it's the demographics is baked in the cake. So what this leaves them with policymakers with, is only two choices. They only have two choices at this point. They can either default on the debt, because we're all awash in debt and there's too much of it relative to our economic base, or you can default on the currency that pays the debt. You default on the debt, well, I've already said they're not going to let that happen. They're not going to let that happen. So what they've chosen is to default on the currency. And what that means is they're going to default on the dollar. And what that means is they're going to print it to kingdom come, and the value of the dollar is going to continue to drop by significant amounts, and everything that's priced in the dollar will go up. You will see real goods inflation. That's why you're seeing food inflation the way you are. You will see asset inflation, because equities tend to be responsive to inflation, especially for those companies that have pricing power. You're going to see bonds will get thrashed on a real basis. Bonds are going to get thrashed on a real basis because all those bonds are being paid back in less and less valuable dollars over time. And you're going to see real estate continue to go up. So that's the choice. That's why it's happening. That's the choice policymakers have made. And at a meta level, what's happening is the U.S. is trying very hard to stay in its position of power, which really means dollar hegemony. Now, when does this change? And what is the real thing that catalyzes the transformation age? Well, transformation age obviously has a lot of moving pieces to it. There's consciousness that's growing as we speak. It's differentiating. It's coming against its own contradictions as we speak every day. Social media is helping with that. Every bad decision Trump makes helps with that. Like, everybody is getting smarter and wiser in real time, even though, with every dumb decision, it's like, that's what's happening. So it's happening in consciousness. It's happening structurally with every new company that tries a B corporation, or every new company that tries something on the blockchain, or every new company that does something slightly innovative. It's coming into being there. It's coming into being technologically, as we've talked about with, AGI, and I think these are actually the paradigm shifters for the real emergence of the transformation age. AGI, artificial general intelligence, quantum computing, free energy, probably some form of true and easy block form social structuration, which by that I mean, if I can create a company, and if I can create something we would currently understand as a company on the blockchain with a network of people who are coherent around a certain values set, and all of those people are simultaneously shareholders, owners, workers, and customers, then I have therefore disrupted the existing capital stack of late stage information age capitalism. But it's got to be easy, right? And I think that will happen. I think it is happening, but they haven't made it easy yet. It's still kind of a pain in the ass to do all those things. So there's these real enabling technologies. But if you want to say okay, so I've just gone through these 3 lines of development, but if you just want to say what's the thing that you watch most closely as the one that could truly be the paradigm changing one, that if it breaks, the world changes, and if it doesn't break, like, we kind of still continue in this irresilient accommodation, it's the role of the dollar. It's the role of the US dollar to maintain US power, because it is the role of that dollar that props up the existing political, financial nexus of the whole thing, of the entire global operating system. It's the role of the dollar that does that. And what I just said was they're going to default on the dollar, meaning they're going to continue to drop its value, right? Gold is going to skyrocket. Silver is going to skyrocket, which it has, by the way. Silver's gone up from what, $16 or $14 an ounce 4 months ago to $28 an ounce. Now it's like, I don't know, 23, 24. But I mean, the markets that understand what's coming have already sniffed this out, right? They've already sniffed out these guys don't have a choice. The US is going to run federal deficits till their eyes water, right? And they're going to default on the dollar, which means everybody who holds dollars is going to get screwed, ultimately. So what do you want to hold? Well, you want to hold all the things that I just mentioned. You want to hold real estate. You want to hold stocks. You want to hold gold. You want to hold silver. You want to hold Bitcoin. You want to hold these things that are going to adjust and ratchet up when the whole new monetary base resets, right? But coming back to the geopolitics of it, as long as the dollar is the hegemon, we live in one system. But what I've just said is from internal decisions, they're actually going to ruin their own hegemony. And that's what's happening. So when does it shift? It shifts as soon as you have a critical mass of solutions that are not dollar centric. That could be, let me just throw out some things. That could be China starting to execute, more and more of its trade in the oil economy in the yuan, which it's doing, by the way. It could be China and Russia starting to build the very large relative gold reserves, which they're doing. It could be them setting up their own kind of block of trading off the dollar, which they're attempting to do. It could be the Internet of Value coming along, and more companies, even within the US or in the Western world, saying, actually, I'm not really interested in trading in the dollar. I mean, yes, you might see it priced in the dollar, but instantly I want to convert it into a blockchain-based gold mechanism so that now I'm not holding dollars. Like, all of these things displace the dollar as the liquid mechanism of transactions worldwide. And as the world calls the bluff on the bankruptness of the dollar, the bankruptcy of the dollar, what happens is Washington power goes down, because it can no longer finance its bad decisions. It can no longer cover up its bad decisions by just printing something to do so. And that changes the domestic calculus entirely. You're going to have a very pissed off group of people internally continuing to be pissed off when inflation shows up, year after year after year, and your 1% is getting richer and richer and richer. So I agree with Giannis that yes, there's going to be what is akin to a blow off in this whole thing. It could last 10 years where it gets to be a complete shit show. But all of the mechanisms are in place where the self-adjustment is going to happen. And the question really is, what are the set of things? When does it happen? What are the set of things that actually catalyze which pieces? Probably unknowable, but I think we know enough to know what some of the broad architectural requirements look like. Sorry for the long answer. This stuff's always complex, right?
Yeah, I think. Oh, Jeremy. Yeah. So I guess one of the questions, Rob, I know I've seen a little bit on Twitter on your thoughts, and we've had a couple of guests sort of being advocates for MMT, and just if you can give your sort of 2 cents on what your beliefs are about that theory.
I think that I'm about halfway through Stephanie Kelton's book. So I want to be careful to not say something that makes me look stupid afterwards, right? And I want to be deferential to that. I think they do give. My understanding is they give credence to the idea that inflation is the rate limiter for the money printing, or for the idea that we can basically finance our own deficits through printing. Let me step aside just a moment and say something that I think is important, regardless of whether we're talking about, regardless of which economic / political philosophy we're talking about. If each one of these economic philosophies doesn't work if you only pull one piece of it and use one piece, but then you keep kind of the other pieces of other systems surrounding it. So for example, if we use MMT, but we use the current inflation standard, we're in no better shape than we would be otherwise, because the inflation will just be hidden. And you could very easily end up in a spot where the 1% are still getting massively rich, even more so, right? Because more and more money now is flowing through Washington, which is very, very good at channeling money to the connected. It's very good at channeling money to the powerful. It's very good at channeling money to Wall Street, and not at all good at transferring money to those who need it. And okay, so you throw MMT on there, and now what you're saying is, well, okay, now you need a really good transfer payment mechanism to get more and more of the federal budget deficit that's being run and being printed down to the people who need it. Okay, fine. But is that the right way to set up a generative, productive Main Street economy? And I would argue probably not. Have you putatively addressed one kind of like narrow partial truth of the problem, which is that, you don't need to worry about budget deficits per se if you can print the dollar and you have currency hegemony? Sure, but that's almost a trivial thing to say, because if you don't look at it holistically, say, well, what's a gallon of milk doing, right? What is rent doing? What are the things doing that are instantly going to respond to that increased money supply in the community, and who wins and who loses? If you don't look at it holistically, you'll realize that the very irresilience I'm pointing to is only going to perpetuate the existing power imbalances. And so I guess the point is that we have to be really careful when we talk about these things to make sure that that there's a holism to the discussion, right? That we look at it in all four quadrants. We look at it politically, we look at what's going on ideologically, we look at what people will actually accept, what their actual behavior will be. Because too often what we end up with is, and I write about this in The Great Release, we end up with this bounded rationality, where within this narrow frame of reference, we can all sort of argue for this rational thing, but it's only rational from within a deeply part-oriented whole. Whereas if we look at it from a much bigger whole, which is systemic and integral and teal in its cognitive sort of scope, you get a much better understanding. And by the way, this is my critique of neoliberalism. Like Hayek had a lot of really important things to say about the philosophy of the combination of free markets, freedom, private property, what have you, which I believe. The problem is if you take that same system and then you surround it with all of the policy dysfunction, the actual legislative dysfunctions that I've listed over the last 40 years, what you end up with is a massively cancerous system because it's nowhere near what they were actually talking about. So that's the problem, I guess. It doesn't matter which one you look at. It doesn't matter where on the spectrum you are. If we're not honest about being comprehensive in aligning all of the requirements that a society would need to run it properly, then you're going to just be piling on dysfunction on dysfunction on dysfunction. And what I'm telling you right now is if we don't get at the core problem, you throw MMT in today and you're probably going to end up in an even bigger world of hurt because right now I think the powerful they'll use it and take it to the bank. I think people, the working and middle class will maybe feel like, oh, finally some progressive help to the rescue, and they will be getting their pocket picked.
I'm feeling very optimistic as this conversation continues, Rob. No, but you are laying it out how it is. And, part of me when thinking about reading your book and thinking about sort of solution-driven decisions, part of me is still left sort of wondering, obviously there's so many parts that goes into it. And a lot of these sound like political decisions, but even looking back at sort of 2008, were you in support of sort of, or not in support of Bernanke's decision to sort of make some of those choices? Like, they talked about banks being too big to fail, and it's only gotten worse since then. And and even I think on both sides of the aisle, you heard people advocating for putting back the Glass-Steagall Act, as you talked about, and nothing's happened. And obviously, it's like, is it just waiting for the populace to kind of become irate, angry, rioting like they are now for some political change to happen? And is that sort of what we're waiting for or as you say, this increasing consciousness to continue to grow before people finally kind of catch on to the lies and the other sort of corruption that we have happening at the moment?
Yeah, well, that's the problem with these things, isn't it? Is we all want the silver bullet. The problem is, in any real complex system, there almost never is a silver bullet. But we can say what the various pieces of the solution need to look like, and we can also say what would, if you had a really enlightened president who was able to capture their party like Trump has captured his, and they had both the Senate and the House, well, you could probably push through all kinds of reforms. You could get executive branch reform, which clearly we need because Trump has shown us every blind spot we've got there. You may be able to push through campaign finance reform. You may be able to get a true gerrymandering standard on the books that the Supreme Court will have no choice but to accept. And that'll at least set the ground for the next 30 or 40 years of increasing function rather than dysfunction. Those are the basics, right? That's at the plumbing level. You could then start on some of the financial reforms. You could start to look at the Fed's mandate, right? And the Federal Reserve's mandate, and say, well, really, should they be in the business of trying to promote employment? I don't think they should be. I don't think we should think of the money supply as being as them having an employment mandate. I think they should be in the business of being neutral about providing enough liquidity to the system in terms of an accurate measure of inflation. Now, you're not going to get a lot of political support for that because you're going to have all of the politicians who love right now to finance their political promises to an unknowing populace to I mean, they love that. It's great for them. But that would actually be a very sound way to get the country back to a point of resilience. See, so like in any complex system, you need real feedbacks, right? You actually need clean, feedbacks. If your body was always telling you had cancer, when you didn't, well, you'd get an autoimmune disorder, right? So in effect, we have an autoimmune disorder because our feedbacks are so effed up because we don't have any clean signaling. So inflation is one of those things that you could do. So that, yes, there's a series of forms, but at the moment you say that, you say, well, okay, how do you do any of this stuff? Because it's all, I mean, that's the problem with system lock-in, is everybody's holding each other's leash. And so all of these problems are interconnected, and that is the nature of power lock-in, is that it becomes so dysfunctional. So when I started the conversation, I said, well, probably what's going to have to shift is either the suffering gets so much that it just goes into a full release. And what release stages do in a complex system is they truly shake the power structure so thoroughly that an actual reorganization can occur. And historically, if we look at 500, 600, 700 years, a true great release is not an awesome thing. It is only a silver bullet in a sense that you would never wish upon anybody. It's a world war. It's a massive 30-year dislocation of the power structure, so that the whole system has to break down and regenerate green shoots from there. In a way, I kind of hope I'm wrong. It'd be really nice to be wrong, because I'm not sure that, I don't know which the better path is. Kind of just stay with a little bit of the suffering we've got now, or to go through that and then have something that's truly reorganized. I mean, history is not kind on that question, actually. But yeah, I mean, so suffering does it. And as I said, technology can be truly disruptive, because technology creates new capabilities that walks around existing power lock-in. It walks around, it disrupts power, because it enables new things to happen that they can't control. Blockchain's a good example. And then the other thing is geopolitically, be a set of actors through various mechanisms or what have you that kind of force the change upon us. I think that there's any combination of these things that could happen. And if they don't, then yeah, it is conceivable that we could be in for another 20 years or more of a kind of growing systemic malaise, a growing wealth inequality. And I don't, and kind of more of the same, maybe not as acute as this summer with a pandemic and riots and all that, although it could be a little bit of that. But I guess I'm more optimistic than that. I think that a lot of this stuff is accelerating. I think it's going to break faster than that. And I don't know how long the US can continue to play this game, because it's getting attacked both from without and within, this power nexus and all of the irresilience it's created.
Yeah, beautifully said, Rob. You also had a little bit of like static on your mic. I don't know if there was a.
Oh, I did. I'm sorry.
There. Oh no, it's fine. Yeah. So you had talked about some specific policies that you think would be helpful. I'm also wondering, just to expand on that, if an integrally informed, like consciously integrally informed political candidate, let's say, ran for president, what kind of leadership do you think we need at this point? Given that there's so much divisiveness, there's so much fracturing culturally, it's kind of a civic crisis, a civil war in a sense, right? What kind of rhetoric would you like to see? What kind of leadership would you like to see? And also, if there were any more policy specifics that you think would be most helpful for just steering the ship a little bit away from disaster and towards the transformation age.
Yeah. So you've probably heard me say before, I think resilience is a scarce resource of the transformation age. And I think that actually not even necessarily related to the Great Release and the fact that we're irresilient today. I actually relate it more to the just life condition of what I think the 21st century is. I think the transformation age is going to be marked by nonlinear black swans that are increasingly not black swans, they're white swans that are coming upon us from the degradation of the environment, climate change, and all of the effects that we will not be able to control. And I think that, and also to some degree the biological outcomes of that. And I think that's, you know, pandemics. It is it's things that have to do with the side effects of what we've done to the oceans, the loss of biodiversity, and then of course the heating up, the fires, the refugees. So I think resilience is going to be the scarce resource of this century, more so than value, for example, in the industrial era, or meaning in the information age. But I think that the power, and you may have heard me talk about the power hierarchy, right? The power to convene, which is the primary new power of the information age, which reconfigured all the prior powers, I think will be supplanted by the power to integrate. And the reason I think the power to integrate will become the new power on the block, and the new power that reconfigures the prior powers. And remember, when we talk about a hierarchy and a truly emergent power, or emergent anything, it actually has to be truly transcending. Like, it actually has to fully transcend what's before. And if it is power we're talking about, it is powerful, meaning it actually has to have the capacity to reconfigure those things, whether they like it or not, right? That's what the nature of a later stage emergent power actually is. I think the power to integrate is that thing. I think the power to integrate is the thing that can reconfigure convening power. It can reconfigure value power. It can reconfigure administrative and bureaucratic power, and the sort of bureaucratic state. So with that as a backdrop, let me talk about or speak to what you just asked. I think the politician and the set of politicians increasingly who will be able to do that will be fundamentally integral politicians. They will be people who can actually speak to both sides of the polarity, who can speak to many different voices inside a human being as a complex composite person, where increasingly they are integrating what today is very fragmented, what today is very polarized. Today in the information age, the convening is going on based on that fragmentation. The convening is going on based on fragmented identities, tribal identities, narrow and simple sort of thought bubbles about who we are or what we stand for. But as we increasingly run into the pain, the actual pain of the contradictions of thinking that simply, we will look for political leaders and business leaders, by the way, and spiritual leaders, it's across the whole leadership thing, who can speak integrally, who can actually speak to a part of us that yearns for unification. So what the green socioculture and structure of consciousness does, especially as it breaks down in the Great Release, is it creates the perfect environment to yearn for integration, to yearn for unity. And that is the environment in which your new political class can arise and start to get a better, more full mandate for integration itself, right? So if you have a teal political leader, if you have a truly kind of complex thinker and a complex human, and they understand the history, they understand a lot of what we're talking about on this call, they actually understand the dynamics. I mean, I would point to, I don't think she's an integral thinker in the way I'm talking about, but she at least understood a lot of the dynamics here. Was Elizabeth Warren. She understood the history of where the financial class had taken advantage of this. And you need somebody who can do that in a lot of domains. They need to understand it, you know, geopolitically. They need to understand it in terms of education. They need to understand it. They need to be really pretty integral. But what happens is the people yearn for that, and they'll start to be listening for that. And then increasingly there'll be a mandate for that. In part 3 of the Great Release, at the very end, I did a cheat sheet for the kind of thinking that an integral political leader would do. It's somebody who can think about whole part dynamics in a holarchy or in a hierarchy. It's somebody who can think about polarities and understand there's always polarities and tensions in any situation, and speak to both. Somebody who understands bounded rationality and kind of can navigate that. These are meta things, and so as integralists, we know that it's, you know, context change and are infinite. So you bring sort of these meta lenses to it to apply to a context. So I'm not, you know, we'd have to nail into a specific context if you wanted to talk about a specific policy to put in place in a given domain, whether it be education or healthcare or what have you. But what I want out of a political leader is I want them to be able to apply this kind of meta level operating within their own body mind to their way of thinking about policy and their way of thinking about the world, and frankly, even their communication. And of course, the problem is, will they, you know, it ain't me. I'd be a shitty politician, but if somebody was good, then they can translate that and they can speak to people, I think, in a way that would resonate with more and more people. And then you throw in the suffering, and I think there may be the opportunity for the rise of those folks.
Do you want to say something, Ryan?
Oh, just a quick follow up on that. You know, it's really that's the most hopeful I felt in this conversation. How you describe that, Rob. One of the things I see, which may be a bit of a confusion from the public, I think, is kind of a pre-trans fallacy around unity, where I think there is a real hunger and longing for unity. I think what kind of scares me is the direction that people want to throw that energy, and I think a large segment of the population thinks unity is kind of like going back to like pre-green, like 1950s, or like, you know, post World War II type of unity, where the kind of unity that we need now, pushing into a more integral age, is postmodern. So it is kind of like a more complex, holarchic, fractal form of unity. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, and how we can be clear in making that distinction of not having more of a regressive form of unity,
Sure,
and more of an integral direction.
Yeah, well, that's exactly. I mean, Trump's run on a regressive form of unity. He's run on the agrarian myth. He's run on the notion of a 1950s, you know, ascendant America for white middle class people. I mean, that is his exact sort of deep structure of his what he's tried to do, and he's done it pretty successfully, on the back of all the alienation they've felt as economically, as we talked about, plus plus how threatened they've felt by the dominance of the postmodern multicultural social holon. And I wouldn't even say the left, just the multicultural, postmodern multicultural holon has been dominant in this country for 30 years. They've absolutely dominated the cultural sphere, the way that you might say the neoliberals have dominated the political sphere, and that's scared a lot of people who that was not an innate move for them, or they don't have that structure yet developed, and what have you. So yeah, he made that move, and that is of course what's attempting to be done right now. So I guess I go further than you. I say, well, you're already living with that. You're already in the hell that you don't want to be living in. Right? You've already got that problem where you have a completely balkanized, regressive tribalism based on a mythological yesteryear, right? And we're seeing what that result looks like. It's riots in the streets. It's complete polarization and breakdown. And I guess that's the interesting thing, you know, because I hope you guys you say you're hearing me as pessimistic. I'm actually very optimistic. That's the point. I'm seeing now as the apex of the shit show. And yes, it may go on a few years because we never know how this stuff plays out. But I think that the really peak learning that's needing to be done is being done inside the American body mind right now, every day. And it's clearly needed to be done because we're here, aren't we? I mean, it needed to be done. The transformation needed to happen. The education needed to happen. So what do I think? That I think America will always be a land of a set of fundamental polarities that are not going away. So even your integral president of 2044 is going to have a whole bunch of people that don't like him from one side of the aisle or the other, or what, right? That's just going to be the way it is. But if the whole country can become more facile about the fact that even this this set of polarities exist within us as a collective, and we are now accommodating that in a more functional and skillful way, well, then you are a hell of a lot further along than you are today. You actually have made an integral move that is far more second tier in the way that Graves meant it in terms of it unifying, right? Than first tier in the form of just these green values communities going at each other full scale, right? So I would say that that well, maybe I answered it. That I think we are heading towards that, and I think we're already in the hell that you describe.
Rob, what's your response? I mean, you're going out meeting with business leaders, and I'm not sure if you're presenting Integral as sort of the next wave and a solution maybe to some of the problems they face in-house and stuff. Do you find there's it's received warmly? Do you find it's sort of, foreign to most business leaders? What's your response when you sort of present some of the integral theory to your folks?
I mostly don't evangelize. I mostly don't. Part of the reason is that I learned a long time ago that someone has to be, there's a set of characteristics that characterize when someone is ready and looking for this kind of a shift in their life. They've often gone through some sort of transformational spiritual experience, perhaps, but they're also trying to make sense of things, and it's become almost untenable that they can't, it's become a point of suffering that they can't have a big enough picture to not feel confused, and they're suffering because of that confusion now. And when those set of conditions are met, you have somebody who's much more apt to be a listener and to be an active learner and to be ready to lean into a true integral philosophy, which is the fundamental idea that, reality is, there's a lot of different pieces to reality, and everyone is right in their own kind of way. And there's a way to make sense of that in a more full and rich way that alleviates suffering and allows you to live with more freedom and fullness. And you'll be more awake and more effective as you move through the world as a parent or a leader or what have you. But you can't walk into a room and make that promise, and because if there's no pain, there's no motivation. And I've said this before, like I said this in one of the keynotes I did on maybe it was cosmic integrity, but it was like I don't have a need to seek transformation on other people's behalf. That is not something that lives in my ego structure anymore. It would be nice. It would be more functionally, I think, generative for the world, but I am there to serve as people create those opportunities, and there's an opportunity for me to do so. But I don't believe that my role is to evangelize. Now, I will say just one last caveat on that is that 5 years ago, I would have said the world's not even really ready for integral. It doesn't seem to be, and it's just a niche intellectual community, and that's fine. Today, we're seeing something I think quite a bit different, which is that it's no longer a luxury good. It's no longer a luxury good. I think people realize that what we're doing is not working. They're encountering massive stress of their own fragmentation. They're encountering massive stress of not having a big enough picture to make sense of the true threats that they feel. And so I think one of the reasons I get asked to do these kinds of discussions and interviews and podcasts a lot is that, as I've said before, big pictures alleviate suffering. It's like if you can actually see a bigger picture, you can then start to more intelligently and skillfully navigate your own life, and hopefully have some more compassion for all the various components that are within it. At the same time, you show up and be very heartful and passionate about fighting where you need to fight. But it's a clean fight. It's like I'm showing up, hopefully without a lot of hate. I'm showing up to fight the evolutionary fight because it needs it. And so, yeah, that's online in a big way, in a way we never could have engineered. Like Trump is the best thing that's ever happened to the world. I would say the whole world waking up to the need for a teal operating system. They would never put it in that language. But I think that the teal operating system has just gotten a clarion call for people realizing we can't continue with business as usual anymore. And it's happening at all levels of scale, in all four quadrants, and geographically just all over the place. And I think that's actually super awesome, frankly.
So, Rob, I got a question from someone in our audience, Christian, who is asking this, and this is hopefully an opportunity to give us more of a hopeful vision of the future. But Christian's asking, what is more effective in fixing the financial system as it is right now, right? So disruptive technology or policy-based solutions? And I would add, or some kind of combination of the two.
Well, if you're looking specifically at the financial space, I would say that's a tough one. I mean, it's hard to pick either or. One of the problems fintech has, so financial technology, is it's always bound by the existing policy structure that's in place. And so you're always going to end up playing by the rules. And some of those rules are in place for very good reasons. So if you look at the blockchain, for example, it presents some extraordinary opportunities for disruption financially in ways, and that's what a real Bitcoin evangelist would tell you, is like, look, this is the first true trans-statal and trans trust oriented or trust requiring system in the world. And I'd say yes, and I love it, and I own Bitcoin. And the moment the US government decides to wipe Bitcoin out, it can do a lot of damage. Like if you're a US citizen, it puts you in an impossible situation, because the policy framework is that current accounts on Bitcoin, they have to know their holders by law. And the moment the US government knows who you are and can then tax that or regulate it or change the convertibility standards, like that becomes deeply problematic. So in every technology disruption that comes along, it also sits within a policy framework. So it's like asking me what's more important, the brain or the heart. I mean, I don't know how to answer that. You need them both. But I do have written down somewhere in one of my notes. Let's see. Here it is. It goes to this question. Like when I think about the transformation age and one of the paradigm shifting technology, and don't ask me how this would happen. I'm just saying, like, this is just a mental brainstorm. Any technology that eliminates the nation state from controlling the digital worlds that are experienced within its borders will be paradigm changing, because it liberates the digital worlds of depth to transcend nations. One of my theses in the transformation age is the nation state gets transcended. And there's a couple ways that could happen. It could happen through a confederation like we saw with the United Nations, but which we also see the nation state still fundamentally as the power enabler can lop off the legs of the United Nations when it wants to. And so how does the nation state really get transcended? I think one possible direction is online, communities of depth. But as we're seeing in China, if you control internet access, you also control that. And so the question is, how does it occur that the nation state really gets transcended? If that's a reasonable thesis, well, any technology that took away their power to be able to control communities of depth in a digital way. And could that be quantum computing, for example, where some combination of non-breakable, non-identifiable quantum, basically quantum capability in the privacy of your own home, and your ability to maybe get signals out elsewhere, creates an ability for you to then create organizations that are fundamentally organizations of depth in all kinds of different ways that the nation state has nothing that they can do about it. Now, it creates a whole nother set of problems, don't get me wrong. But that's an example where these kinds of real disruptive things could come along and change the answer I just gave. But at least today, we're sitting in a spot where the policy frameworks and the disruptive technologies go hand in hand. But what we know is when disruptive technology comes along, the policy also is kind of playing catch up to try to re-govern it. And so then we go full scale back to, okay, well, what are voters doing and how is it serving them? And maybe the voters will force, policies that are more effective. So.
Thank you, Rob. That's very, very thought provoking. I'll have to rewatch this recording several times. So we're coming up on our time here, but just the final question I have to ask you, I think it's on everyone's mind. Predictions, hopes, anxieties about November election?
I think the presidency has too much power. I think that's one of the lessons we've learned over the last 4 years. It has way, way too much power. And the legislative system in the U.S., the system was designed fundamentally where the legislature is the first among equals. That was really the intention of the framers for good reason. And we've gotten ourselves in a situation where we've put the executive as first among equals. And so my big concern is the same concern everyone has, which is I think that the power of the executive to really, really put us in a situation where the election is seen as fully illegitimate. And I think it's going to be seen as illegitimate anyway. So let's be clear. It's going to be seen as illegitimate no matter what happens, because there's going to be a part of the country that does. But I think it's going to be in his best interest to cast as much illegitimacy in it as possible, especially if he loses, and he'll do it early and often. So in Twitter recently, I said, these are the three dynamics I see. He's going to declare a win early. Mail-in ballots probably going to take longer to count. So you could see an election night win for Trump that's not a real win yet, right? Because not everything's been counted. He will declare the win, and he'll pack up and go home, and everything else at that point will be a court fight and a legitimation crisis within the country. You're going to have reports of foreign interference, and I think that's actually plays to their benefit. The more they can make it look like there was any report of legitimate fraud, even if it's from China, even if it's from Russia, the more it casts the notion that the mail-in balloting could be fraudulent in whole cloth. And so, we're just dealing with this horrible set of dynamics that what are my predictions? I think he loses. I think he's gonna lose fairly handily. But whether it's going to feel that way and whether it's going to feel like a win, I would be very surprised. And so I think Americans are going to face one of the most defining moments of this union since 1859, 1860 in the next 6 months. I've said that a few times. And I said it almost 3 years ago on Twitter. I said, I think that the moment of this nation's definition and reanimation is coming. And I think it's going to come in the next 6 months. And you know what? If you don't think that's optimistic, I'm sorry, but people weren't fundamentally optimistic in 1860 either. Like, sometimes history calls you to a hard task, and it is our task, and that is just the way it is.
Awesome, Rob. I like how you're frank and blunt and lay it all out. Jeremy, do you have a final question?
No, just thank you, Rob. This has been a great analysis of the current landscape, and we hope to have you back on perhaps post-election to talk about where we're headed. So,
and by the way, I hope I'm wrong on that. So, and hopefully, yes, hopefully we're all celebrating a fantastic election. It was nice to chat with you guys, and as always, it was really neat to be with you, and I hope some of it was useful.
Awesome.
Definitely.
Thank you, Rob, so much.
Thank you so much, Rob.
All right, guys, take care.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Rob.